First, I want to explain by presenting some very basic concepts that I will operate with here, and I do operate with, work with in my writings as well as how they relate or are similar to what Thomas does, and why it makes sense to share a course. So what we have in common and what are the similarities and differences in terminologies and objects of interest we share. Okay, so first of all, we both teach on Marx. We both problematize the concept of dialectics. We both advocate a strong materialist position, let's say, but we problematize the understanding of Marxist materialism as per the diamat, so dialectical materialism, as a doctrine that has been established and has been, let's say, not the dogma, but almost a dogma, or holding a similar status in the tradition of Marxism. In the different, regardless of the strong traditions of Marxism. Therefore, it's very difficult to convince a scholar, even a scholar of authority in Marxism, that diamat, so dialectical materialism, is in fact a theory that is derived from Marx, but one cannot really find a strong foundation or a solid, convincing foundation in the original oeuvre of Marx, in the original text. So the overall text, everything written by Marx and Engels, but Marx in particular, and I'm focusing on Marx actually only here, and I think that Thomas will focus on Marx as well, only and exclusively. So one cannot find a solid foundation, a convincing argument there in favor of the establishment of this doctrine and this understanding of Marxism, of materialism. I'm sorry, not of Marxism, of Marxism as well, but of materialism in particular. That is the object of discussion here. So we both. So I'm doing an intro on behalf of the both of us in a way. We both go against this misconception, this or this spontaneous assumption about Marx and his original project. And yes, his original project, Marx is an author, just like any other author. It's not the Bible. So therefore, we're allowed to access his texts directly and interpret them without any awe of, like approaching the original text and need of mediation through authority, etc., etc. A kind of exegesis of Marx. It's not necessary, even though it has been a tradition in Marxism, in Marxist theory, both theory and praxis. We have been always accessing the original text through some kind of an exegesis, some kind of an exegete of authority, be it through Lucas, be it through Althusser, or Lenin, or Luxemburg, whoever. Regardless, it's always been via somebody. there seems to be this treatment of the text, as I said, comparable to that of the Bible, and and as if this mediation of an authority, another authority, on Marx is required. No, Marx is an author just like any other author, and we are capable of reading his text directly. And his text is actually not at all mysterious nor complex. I mean, it is complex, but it's not complicated. It's not obscure in style to follow. His text is rather clear, and what I would suggest is to read him to the letter. The more literal in our reading of Marx, the closer we are to the point was that, let me just remove this screen. Wait just a second. So yeah, the point was approaching the text directly. Yeah, the point was that there is no serious grounds there in the original text to speak of dialectical materialism or materialism in the sense of dialectical materialism as per the diamat or diamat as established after Lenin. And indeed, the origin of this kind of orthodoxy, this would be the second orthodoxy, let's say, of Marxism, this diamat Marxism. This orthodoxy indeed begins with Lenin, exactly, and there are others who build on it afterwards, of course, and this happens through a certain Hegelization and philosophization of Marx. Lenin sought to redeem Marx as a philosopher because it was probably perceived that he lost his project lost seriousness by losing or rejecting, because Marx in fact rejected its self-definition as philosophy, its understanding of itself as a philosophical project. Marx's project, entire project, life project, Marx's entire over is an anti-philosophical project of an exit from philosophy. So you are probably familiar with that he kept speaking about, exiting philosophy and establishing a certain science, etc., etc., etc. Nonetheless, the science that Lenin and everybody else afterwards established of Marxism through the doctrine of the diamat or dialectical materialism was done through a kind of a reverse legitimization of everything that Marx said through Hegel. So reintroducing Hegel again, except presenting him as a potentially materialist thinker. So that's, let's say, the core of that orthodoxy. But there is another use of the term orthodox Marxism, which is more orthodox. It's what Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, and others, so those who precede the establishment of the, let's say, mainly Lenin influence understanding of the diamat, all of those who understood prior to this point Marx's texts as something essential, as something that should be read to the letter, that should be at least not falsified through interpretation. You had interpretation. There are books of economic accumulation by Rosa Luxemburg. There are books by Kautsky, etc. Plekhanov. All of them wrote books on Marxist books. So it does not mean that they were just, this keepers of the original thought, the original terminology of Marx, etc., etc. Just being, the Cerberus, each of them, of the original Marx. No, there was intellectual production. It was more stance to the original thesis and some of the original goals of Marxists, and therefore the original or the oldest form of the Marxian project, the fundamental goals of it should be preserved. And if a thinking or political action according to this first group of as the representatives of the orthodoxy, or the representatives of this first form of orthodoxy, let's say. So according to them, this falsification of the original, stakes of Marx's and the oldest Marxian project, if those were, according to them, falsified, thwarted to such extent, skewed in order to fit a certain ideological, philosophical project, etc., etc., to the extent that the original commitments are unrecognizable. In that respect, on those several points, they were orthodox. They were orthodox about them, and I will present those points in a moment. Even though we're dedicating this class and this course to several themes that are laid out there in the syllabus, but I'll go quickly through this commitments of the Orthodox Marxism in its original sense. So not the diamat Leninist orthodoxy that followed afterwards. So some of those original tenets that were to be preserved, or original commitments and stakes that ought to be observed and brought to certain fruition in political practice, according to this group of the representatives of the original orthodoxy, let's call them. So I'm talking Kautsky, Plekhanov, this line of thinking. Those points are not to abandon Marx's project of going beyond philosophy. So his constant ambition to exit philosophy and establish a certain science, a science of the species being of humanity, as he would call it. That's one thing. The other thing is this division and opposition between the collective and the individual was, according to them, and according to these quotes I found in Marx to read to you, this division between the individual and the collective was, and even opposition and tension between the two of them, is also something that some of the orthodox Marxists, like Rosa Luxemburg, for example, could not accept. So sacrificing the individual on behalf in the name of the collective, but also vice versa. So their understanding was that the one did not exclude nor required to sacrifice the other. So that was another point of a misunderstanding, or not just misunderstanding, direct confrontation. For example, in the case of Rosa Luxemburg, direct confrontation with Lenin. But some of the original ideas that are, in fact, philosophical, the concerns there are philosophical, even though Marx declared himself to be the thinker that sought a way to exit philosophy and establish a materialist science. So I'm using the word materialist now. So even though the project was of such nature, in fact, in order to adhere to the original goals, investments, intellectual and political investments of Marxist project, we have to go through his main philosophical thesis or questions and resolutions to certain questions that he proposed. And paradoxically, all of them come down to an exit from philosophy, but these are philosophical positions. Or elsewhere, I insisted that maybe we should not call them philosophical, but in fact metaphysical. I tried to recuperate the notion of metaphysics through that, insisting that we all do, even in sciences, we do metaphysics. We want to understand the universe. We want to know if there is an end to existence, if we can speak of the infinite or the finite, and that can be approached. We want to rein in and control nature. These are all metaphysical impulses, I would say. So this is something more primal, let's say, than philosophy. Whereas philosophy, especially if seen as something detached from science, like since Enlightenment onwards, so in its post-Enlightenment form of existence, so as something detached from science, philosophy is perhaps the word that we should kind of put aside, especially because Marx sought to, as I said, exit philosophy, and also sought to reduce the use of the term and invoke the relevance of philosophy as little as possible. In fact, he invoked it only in order to reject it and to prove its not collision, but contradiction, let's say, with his project of establishing a new form of science. So all of these things were, let's say, the original concerns. And as I said, in order to address them in their true depth, if you have reservations to use the term metaphysics the way I use it, after all, even Marx himself had a problem with metaphysics as such. Actually, he had a problem with philosophy because, according to him, philosophy was always already metaphysics. Therefore, we reject both. So I'm recuperating the term for the needs I just explained. I think that when we speak of metaphysics, we speak of some sort of more primordial, more primal, as I said, questions and movers of investigation. Therefore, it might be more appropriate to use the term and reject or shy away from using the term philosophy, simply in order to maintain fidelity to the original vocabulary introduced and maintained by Marx, and also not just to the vocabulary, but also to the project itself. Okay, so those finally, I'm arriving at the point. What are those deeper levels of discussion, tenets of his project? What is that thing that I would call philosophical, but choose not to instead call it metaphysical, that truly explains Marx's project, and also puts it in a not just juxtaposition, but an opposition, I would say, to the diamond. First of all, his exit from philosophy, his project of an exit from philosophy, is premised on the following argument. Philosophy always already ends up being idealism. That is why now I'm arriving to the following point. Why am I speaking of a radical materialism and still remain cautious of the term materialist? In that way, I'm miming what Marx used to do, because he had those reservations toward the term materialist philosophy. Therefore, materialism. His argument was the following. If you remember his discussions on Feuerbach, sorry, let me silence the notifications. His issue with Feuerbach was that even though materialist and Marx granted some relevance to this attempt, to this project of Feuerbach, and to the importance of this attempt to establish a materialist philosophy, yet again found many deficiencies in the project itself and rejected it. And Feuerbach boils down to the following. Feuerbach remains an idealist, according to him. He remains an idealist. And this is due to the fact, and you can find this, I will tell you in which texts, this argument, but I think that it's most clearly stated in German ideology, the chapters on Feuerbach. Actually, there is an entire heading on Feuerbach, and the chapters on this heading, or vice versa, chapter on Feuerbach and then headings on materialism, idealism, etc. So there, I think he's most explicit. He says the problem with interestingly, also in his critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, which is part of the early manuscripts. sometimes is published as part of it, sometimes individually. So there as well, he finds the same mistake, identifies the same mistake in Feuerbach. So you see, it's very interesting. There is no epistemological break. Whatever he identifies in his later work with Engels as a problem in Feuerbach is identified in exactly the same way in the early writings in the critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, where he discusses Feuerbach. And that thing is the following. Feuerbach fails to produce materialism or materialist philosophy simply because he remains a philosopher. His implication is, as long as your arguing is premised on philosophical or is enabled by philosophical thinking, and yes, is premised on what is the, let's say, identity of the last instance of all philosophy. I'm sorry, just a second. So whatever is based on these two things, actually, if you're a philosopher, you would have to depart from what Laruelle and Althusser would call the identity of the last instance or determination of the last instance of philosophy. So you would have to depart from that thing. And that thing, that determination of the last instance of all philosophy that he has an issue with, and that's why he thinks that we should exit it, is that philosophy is a sort of a self-mirroring, auto-referential type of thought, whereby human puts itself at the center of the universe, and from that position on projects the outside reality of that universe. So the universe is his or her or their projection. Or maybe if we're talking about philosophers, his is fine. So it's his projection. So that's why you have a subjective idealism, or never mind. You have variations of all sorts of things. You have even the variation of Feuerbach, which is, materialist philosophy. And still, because it has this determination of the last instance at its core, as its source, it ends up being too philosophical, and therefore, because too philosophical, always already idealist. So the entrapment of idealism is never surpassed, neither by Feuerbach nor by any materialist philosophy known to Marx, to at least in the time of his life and his active production as a philosopher. So the problem is the following: you remain inside of philosophy, therefore you remain inside of idealism. Therefore, there is no such thing as materialist philosophy. If there is no such thing as material philosophy, Feuerbach has failed, but any future diamat would fail, because dialectical materialism is premised on Hegel's dialectics. And Hegel's dialectics is philosophical. And Lenin does not hide that, and he deems it necessary to add a little bit of Hegel to Marx in order to disclose the true philosophical potential of Marxist work. So all of this that the diamat entails goes against the original idea of Marx. And this is what the first lineup of orthodoxy I was talking about was protective about, but to a certain extent, like, Kautsky would say, oh, Marx was always against Hegel, or I don't know, Rosa Luxemburg would say, no, this division, individual, collective is false. But those arguments do not, I believe, do not even begin to unravel not just the differences between the diamat and all forms of philosophy and Marx's original writings, but also the true potential of the revaluing of all values. Let's use a Nietzschean phrase, that Marx's original text has the potential to offer. So there is materialism in Marx, but this materialism is not dialectical. Certainly not in the Hegelian sense. Now, I know that I'm saying things that sound so counterintuitive. If you go on, Encyclopedia Britannica, you will see that, it kind of goes without saying there is no examination there if, there is such a thing as a possible detachment in discussion of dialectical materialism or dialectics from materialism. It's so engraved in the tradition of Marxism, it sounds like, almost scandalous when you say and insist that the two can be and have to be detached. So dialectical from Marxism, from materialism. So we're detaching these two, Thomas and I. Then I would go now further and explain that instead of materialism, we should use more often the term realism, or not necessarily in our interpretations, but we should be aware that he shied away from the use of the term, as I said, and I said why, and instead used real. And realism and sensuousness, nature, physicalism, even words like that, instead of matter, material, or materialist. And he did so I already explained why through the story about Feuerbach. Materialism as such, coming from within the realm of philosophy, is already too philosophized or too philosophical, irrecuperably so. Therefore, it's safer, or let's say the terminology is more pure, if we operate with the terms, also objective, but he explains how he uses the term objective, which is completely different from the empiricists of his era or the positivists, or etc. So materialism seen as something apart from dialectics, then or from dialectical materialism. Then I go further and I say we also we should also rather speak of realism than materialism if we are to be true to Marx's original vocabulary. But as I said, it's not a mistake at all to speak of a materialism, as long as we understand each other, that the Marx used the terms real and sensuous and physical, and sometimes even objective, rather than matter and materialist, due to the reasons I just explained. But still, his project was essentially materialist. The goal was materialist, and that is explained. That is not explained. That's explicit. That's explicit. He praises for materialist philosophy, but also reprimands him for failing, because he remained inside of philosophy. So he too is in favor of materialism, but he would do it in a different way. And in order to avoid the terminological confusion, he resorts to these terms. So this is already rendering something so familiar, so unfamiliar, but this is the original terminology we find in Marx, and these are the original arguments. Then it's interesting when he speaks of dialectics, which is very rarely, he speaks of the method, not of an ontology. To paraphrase Aristotle, I think in this sense he is very similar to Aristotle. There is a difference between the thing toti, the thing of which in Greek toti, the thing of which we speak, and the way we speak about things. So dialektike, dialectics, or dialektike, the ancient Greek terms of the science of, on and off good reasoning. Dialektike is something that remains on this side of the noumenon. It's a matter of cognition of, our human capacity to reason about the outside world, as Marx says, in an objective way. I'll explain objective in what sense, and that was supposed to be the topic of this first lecture, the anti-subjectivism, but the intro is taking too long, and maybe it's good, and we can then kind of read more closely what I need to say on this matter in the next class, if there is not time this time. So yeah, what was I saying? Yeah, okay, materialism put aside. Yeah, objectivism. Then the use of real and objective instead of material and matter. But yes, this is still, and essentially it is so, a materialist project, because the accusation of Marx is toward Feuerbach is that he failed to provide a proper materialism. Okay, so then dialectics. Yes, I was explaining about dialectics. So dialectics is used in Marx is, in this sense, it's let's say a craft of gaining a rational, acquiring, forming rational knowledge of the outside and objective world, and it's used in the original, let's say, Greek sense of the word. So it's not projected, again, going back to his critique of Hegel and to subjectivism and subjectivity-centered thought as the essence of all every philosophy since the beginning, as something that is, a projection of human subjectivity onto the outsideness as if an objective reality, regardless of whether we're subjectivists or objectivists or materialists or idealists. It comes down to that. in all forms of philosophy, according to him. So in this respect, he moves away, therefore, from this subjectivity-centered thinking, and thus from philosophy as such, and adopts the term objective and objectivism in a way which is specific, pertaining to his form of thought or his philosophy. It's still philosophy in spite of his attempt to exit it. So objective to him is, as I said, not what we find in positivism and Kant or the others. Objective is the ability to not be anthropocentric, so not self-centered in, you know, this colloquial sense, everyday sense of the word, not self-centered in, you know, the deontological way, sense of the word, in the ethical sense of the word, but in this deeply metaphysical sense of the word as self-centered in the sense of human subjectivity-centered form of thinking. That is the core of philosophy, as we discussed, as I already said. And so objectivism would be the opposite to this. So he, mind you, he does not dismantle or declare the term of subjectivity irrelevant or non-existent. He just proposes that we treat subjectivity objectively. So an object among objects. And do not think immediately object-oriented ontology or similar, because it's not like that. An object-oriented ontology is like paradoxically subjectivization of the objects. So it's subjective view, or a view on the object of the objects from a subjective point of view. This is the opposite, the other way around. And maybe I should read that quote on the objective. Yeah, here. So you will find in this quote, this is from Critique of Hegel's Philosophy in General. You will find in this quote the critique of subjectivity-centered thought, a critique of philosophy as such, a critique of anti-materialist, idealist way of thinking. You will see that he uses different words here to describe the same. And he also explains this, the use of the term objectivity and objective. So he speaks of the following. So this is opposed to a Hegelian vision of the world, not of the world, of oneself as well, of the human self as well, of universal existence, of everything, the core of Hegel's philosophy, which is merely, according to Marx, it's merely the apex of all philosophy. All philosophy is this, a production of this, how does he call it? The universal egoist. He uses that term, projected onto the outsideness. So Hegel is just, you know, the apex or the caricature of what all philosophy has as a problem, key deficiency, a deficiency at its core, that it's maybe irremediable and one ought to exit it, as as Marx proposes. So here, those of you who know of Laruelle, Francois Laruelle, and non-philosophy, and also the non-philosophical variant of Marxism that I work with, will recognize the similarities between Laruelle and Marx. Non-philosophy, the issue with this self-mirroring form of thought, putting human subjectivity in front of the outside reality, or as Marx would call it, the objective reality. The objective reality, outsideness, or the real, as Laruelle would call it, submitting itself to a postulate produced by a philosopher as to what reality is. So philosophy always bends reality so that it fits its image of reality. And this is what Laruelle calls the amphibology of philosophy. What is the amphibology of philosophy? The amphibology of philosophy is its attempt to be both the truth of the real and the real itself, or to produce or be the truth of the real and the real itself. And there is this constant urge toward deeper and deeper penetration into the real, so that truth and the real merge into one true entity or forms of existence. And what is this, if not some sort of epiphany, which is practically, a religious dream? So both Laruelle and Marx propose that we detach the two, that we admit what Laruelle, following Lacan, would call the foreclosure of the real, the fact that thought ought, human thinking, that's thought in Laruelle's terminology, ought to submit to the real, produce an account of it, and mind you, admitting its radical foreclosure, yet attempting to produce an account of it. What is this? This is an admission that we are always driven toward explaining outsideness, reality, even when we fall into a soliloquy or insist that everything is a construct to the extent that, the tree doesn't fall if we don't hear it. Even if we adopt such a stance, we're still driven by this initial primal in the metaphysical mover to give an account of this externality, of this outsideness, even of ourselves as some form of reality that we, as if someone else speaking of somebody else, gives an account of, and it sounds true as possible. So we are moved by this, and Laruelle admits that this is what thought does, and it can do, to a certain extent, produce some knowledge of the real, be a witness of it, code its effects, interpret certain patterns of this codes that are produced, or signifiers that are put here and there, and a pattern is produced out of them. So a form of knowledge. So the real is foreclosed, but it can be mediated through language and signification. And even though in a very limited way, a certain knowledge of it can be produced. So this type of thinking has the modesty of science. Science, every form of science, admits its absolute limitations, allows for contradicting theories as long as they work. So science admits its impotence vis-a-vis the universe, but still does its best to form an account of it. So maybe this is the similarity between Laruelle's notion. So what I just explained is Laruelle's idea of a posture of thought that is scientific. He calls it that way. And that is very similar to what Marx proposes, and for very similar reasons. Philosophy is, again, that thing that bends the real and produces this amphibology whereby real and thought are unified in a certain higher form of reality, which is truth reality, or reality improved into a status of truth, whereby the two are merged. So Marx displays the same aversion toward this drive. Therefore, he proposes exit from philosophy, and instead of what Laruelle, or not instead of, but in addition, next to what Laruelle just proposed and I just explained, Marx proposes this third party's perspective, seeing everything, including human subjectivity, as object among objects, or objectivity and objectivism in this sense of the word I just explained, which, as you can see, I'm assuming you can, is something very different from, the positivist objectivism. So now, before I read the quotes, I will open the floor for questions in a moment. But before I do that and read the quotes, I need a moment to take a glass of water, and I'll be right back. Okay, so here I am, and I'll start with the end. With what I was just talking about, objectivism. And then we can go and revisit the topics at the beginning or spoken earlier. So he says, this is a quote from Critique of Hegel's Philosophy in General. We see this of Hegel's philosophy in general, and there is always this critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, or at its heart, and that's why the diamat and this reading of Marx through Hegel is so peculiar. I mean, I can understand that someone might adhere to Marxism, Leninism, or Leninism simply, but one has to be aware how opposite this is to the original project of Marx. And yeah, before going to the quote, just one more remark. What we have in common, another thing that we have in common with Thomas, and that's why we share this course, we both believe that everything begins and ends in Marx. Be it there are some epistemological breaks or not, and I argue they're not, and I'll prove now in a moment why not. But even if there were, some things remain there from the beginning until the end, and we both believe that they originate from his doctoral thesis. His thesis was on Greek atomism, and the origin of true materialism. And he kind of extracts the atomist, especially Lucretius's and Epicurus's version of atomism, that which entails the swerve of the atoms. So the imperfection, that's the key thing, as that which enables movement, because perfection is a human construct. In the outside material world, all of the forms can be likened to some conceptual ideal form, but this is a concept. In reality, there are no circles, there are ellipses, etc., etc. There are not perfect phonemes, as Saussure would say. They're just variations of r, r, etc., right? But it's ideal r. You would pronounce it r. I'm pronouncing it now r, but otherwise I would say r is the ideal. So anyway, the ideal. So I jumped quickly to linguistics simply to illustrate that similarly to what we find in mathematics and geometry, in philosophy, the ideal is a conceptual construct, produce. The outside world is a world where atoms swerve, therefore movement and change are possible. And this is the heart of this late Greek atomism that Marx is inspired by, and he really extrapolates this legacy, links it a bit to the legacy of Aristotle. What's materialist there as potential, and remains, since his doctoral thesis, basically wary and deeply skeptical toward everything idealist. So we haven't even gotten to political philosophy yet, but all these things are important because now we are trying to reach some understanding on the vocabulary. So we said about materialism, we said about the problematic aspects of the spontaneous use of the term. If it's philosophical materialism, we detached it from dialectics, especially Hegel's dialectics. We declared that Marxist materialism has nothing to do with the diamond. So we are agreeing on, or I am presenting, we will see if we agree on all this terminological specificities of what I am going to talk about in these classes, and to some extent, what we share with Thomas. And so now, yeah, about the third person's perspective and the objective being. And yeah, just to wrap it up, all this derives from Marx's doctoral thesis. We both argue. So dialectics is used in the Greek philosophical sense of the word. It's not something that should be projected onto the outside world. The world is not dialectics. Dialectics is how we use our brains. That's even what Aristotle says. And as a good classicist or philosopher that is knowledgeable in classical philosophy and has command of Greek, like Marx, he's very precise about the use of the term dialektike. Dialektike is our cognitive organon. It is not to be projected on the outside world. So he uses dialectics in his thesis like that. Further on in his later work, in any of his published works, you will hardly ever run into the term. But instead of that, we have materialism, more often than not termed as realism, as I already said. Instead of that, we have objectivism. And now I will read the quote from a critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, because that's why I was reminded that I should tell you about the doctoral thesis as well, because here this distanciation between the use of the term dialectics in its original sense and in Hegel is made clear. But going back to the quote on objectivism and the objective being, he says the following there: a being which has no object outside itself, so the spirit, let's say, in Hegel's philosophy, or the philosopher, it's the same actually, he would say, Marx would say, he implies. So a being which has no object outside itself is not an objective being. A being which is not itself an object for some third object has no being for its object. Thus subjectivity, this is my insertion, thus subjectivity or subjectivity-centered thought that cannot render itself an object for a third party's perspective is a mirage. It's an illusion. It's unreal. I mean, this is a Marxist term, and renders itself irrelevant if no discourse of objectivity of subjectivity is possible. Okay, this was my intervention. Let's go back to the quote. So he says, a being which is not itself an object for some third being has no being for its object. That is, it is not objectively related. And in order, this is again my intervention in the quote, in order to have a science of the species being of humanity, we ought to be able to speak of social relations, right? Marx does not talk about cultures, etc. He speaks of social relations. And they trump state and other forms of social organization, but that's a different topic. And let's not digress for too long. So going back to the quote, it is not objectively related. Its being is not objective. A non-objective being is a non-being. For this third object, I am thus a different reality than itself. That is, I am its object. Thus, to suppose a being which is not the object of another being, so no social relations, right? Thus, to suppose a being which is not the object of another being is to presuppose that no objective being exists. So this is a self-defeating position. My intervention. As soon as I have an object, I'm going back to the quote. As soon as I have an object, this object has me for an object. But a non-objective being is an unreal. So a non-objective being, so pure subjectivity centered thought or pure subjectivity, not being able to posit itself as objects among objects, establishing social relations. So this was my intervention. So a non-objective, going back to the quote, a non-objective being is unreal, non-sensuous thing, a product of mere thought, that is, of mere imagination, an abstraction. So there is constant attack on abstraction in Marx. But now I'm intervening in the quote again. But these attacks on abstractions are attacks on abstraction that is reified. This is something that Lukács discusses in Class Consciousness, but also Marx himself. So his problem is with abstraction acting as if real, and sometimes and not an activity of the human brain or its product, a concept. Yeah, so not acknowledged as such, but pretending that this idea that we have, this abstraction, is not only real, but very often material. So this posturing of the abstraction as a reality, so sometimes as materiality, therefore this ontologization of an epistemic, gnoseological, or cognitive process, call it what you will. So this ontologization of something which is not ontological, which is part of the dialectique as the craft of rational reasoning. So abstraction should be seen as such and not as an entity in and of itself, as part of, as an aspect of ontology. So this is what he keeps attacking, not the procedure, in thinking, the skill, the capacity, the faculty of abstract thinking. He's not attacking that. He's attacking the ontologization of abstraction. When he attacks abstraction constantly in his early works, but some would say, aha, only in the early works. No, not true. In the later works as well. Ideology is middle work, let's say, but in the manifesto as well. And also, what do you think the critique of reification and fetishism would be about, if not that? Abstraction, such as money, money form or commodity form, regardless, so pure value, a concept, posturing as we actually invite this posturing, the philosophical reason, right, and capitalist reason invites this posturing as real, as if real. But we also all live entrapped by in this false belief that money is a real thing, you know, that having these objects, or even if it's a card or whatever, that it's a real thing somehow, in some way, a material thing. No, it's an abstraction, and it's fine to treat it as such. What's wrong is to confuse it with the material and the real, which are something completely different. So anyway, I moved to capital just briefly to show you that the discussion continues there as well. on the problem of ontologization of abstraction, and that there is no such thing as an epistemological break in Marx. The discussion continues as the same thing. Attacked since the thesis on Epicurus and atomism through the philosophical early writings, actually anti-philosophical writings, to his political economy or capital. So this was a digression, but an important one, because we meet here the notion of abstraction in a purely philosophical conversation. But I wanted to point to the consequences of this conversation on matters political, economic, etc., etc., etc. And also that this conversation traverses his entire over. There are no breaks. So anyway, the digression was too long, so I will repeat the sentence. So he says, as soon as I have an object, this object has me for an object, but a non-objective being is unreal, non-sensuous thing, a product of mere thought, that is of mere imagination, an abstraction. To be sensuous, that is, to be really existing, means to be an object of sense, to be a sensuous object, to have sensuous objects outside oneself, objects of one's sensuousness. And to be sensuous is to suffer. End of quote. Then, continuing from the same text, whenever real, so here again he is attacking he actually, right before this quote, he just attacked Hegel for creating this unreal human, as well as unreal spirit, whatever this entity is, which is in fact a human-centric self-projection. And that's where he sees the key problem in Hegel's and all philosophy. And so this abstract man, and then this abstract man extended to spirit, and this universal egoist that he calls this idea of the spirit. So right after attacking this, Marx continues with the following. So I'm quoting again. Whenever real corporal man with his feet firmly on the solid ground, man exhaling and inhaling all the forces of nature, posits his real, objective, essential powers. So you see, he is not saying material, but he means material. Posits his real, objective, essential powers as alien objects by his externalization. It is not the act of positing which is the subject in this process. It is the subjectivity of objective essential powers whose action therefore must also be something objective. An objective being acts objectively, and he would not act objectively if the objective did not reside in the very nature of his being. He only creates, so this is the real, sensuous, etc. man, the non-abstract man he advocates. This is my digression. Going back to the quote, he only creates or posits objects because he is posited by objects. Because at bottom, he, so the real human, he is nature. In the act of positing, therefore, but mind you, this nature is again not the philosophical idea of nature. And this is not some kind of romantic naturalism or romanticization of nature. This is an era where Darwin was a breakthrough. So when he says nature, he again means material approach to our ecosystems. Let's put it that way. So we are part of this ecosystem system. That's why we're objects to other objects, forming social relations, but also continuity with our surroundings, thus establishing a certain ecosystem. I mean, if you knew, probably some of you know, the entire text here or similar texts elsewhere, that you would, I guess, recognize that this interpretation that I'm forwarding here is quite possible. So, because at bottom his nature. So, in the act of positing, therefore, this objective being does not fall from his state of pure activity into a creating of the object. On the contrary, his objective product only confirms his objective activity, his activity as the activity of an objective natural being. Third, finally, this process must have a, this is from the same text, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy in General. Finally, this process must have a bearer, a subject, but the subject only comes into being as a result. Interestingly, like in Lacan, right? Like structuralism. But the subject only comes into being as a result. I mean, I'm going back to the quote. This result, continues Marx, the subject knowing itself as absolute self-consciousness. Here he's criticizing Hegel, the paradoxical result of elevating the subject to the status thus explained. So this result, the subject knowing itself as absolute self-consciousness, is therefore God, absolute spirit, the self-knowing and self-manifesting idea. But real man and real nature become mere predicates to this abstract and absolute man. Symbols of this hidden, unreal man, of this unreal nature. Now you see, if you're Hegelian, well, we, all of us here in this room, we're just predicates to this real man, which is in fact unreal, self-manifesting idea, and we, the real living beings, are mere predicates. Simple real nature. So, subject and predicate are therefore related to each other in absolute reversal. A mystical subject-object, or a subjectivity reaching beyond the object, the absolute subject as a process, a subject alienating itself. So this is the subject of philosophy, every philosophy. And this is the part where he criticizes both Hegel and Feuerbach. This is why Feuerbach does not achieve true materialism. And that is why we would speak of realism and sensuousness and nature, etc., because of this worry about Feuerbach's materialism. So this is what we come up with, both thanks to Hegel and thanks to the wrong version of materialism preferred by Feuerbach. So he says, subject and predicate, going back to the quote, subject and predicate are therefore related to each other in an absolute reversal, a mystical subject-object, or a subjectivity reaching beyond the object. So a self-sufficient subjectivity, right? The absolute subject as a process, a subject alienating itself and returning from alienation to itself, but at the same time, retracting this alienation into itself, and the subject as this pure process. A pure, incessant revolting within itself. So this is the subjectivity center that is a constant object of criticism. Abstraction is constant object or target of Marxist criticism. And as I hope proved by referring to later and very early works, this is a recurring theme. So this stance is constant there. So once again, before we finish, I know we're a little bit late, but we can extend the session. I think that all this introductory remarks, they may be scattered, I'm sorry. I meant this as a very short intro of 15 minutes, but I keep going and going with the intro. But I realized while I was talking that if I go straight to my text, or if you go straight to Zonretel, the readings I assigned, which you're not obliged to read, but it's highly recommended, all of that will be unclear without this long introduction. Even though scattered and long, I think it was in fact necessary, because both of us have a rather unorthodox yet seeing itself as radically orthodox view of Marx. So let me finish with some final quotes and then see if there are questions. So this is from the Communist Manifesto. So you see here again, we see the big themes. Call them philosophical. I think that Marx would object. Call them metaphysical. I think that Marx would object, but maybe if I explain how I understand and use the term, he wouldn't. I don't know. I'm joking. Anyway, but these, let's call them philosophical themes, great philosophical questions, research in the manifesto itself as well, which is supposed to be a practical thing, a practical piece of writing. So he says that the following: the French socialist and communist literature was thus completely emasculated. I'm apologizing for this sexism. They all were like that back then. So they were completely emasculated, and since it ceased in the hands of the German to express the struggle of one class with the other, we felt conscious of having overcome French one-sidedness. This should not be seen as, nation against nation. He's talking about the era of the communes. Now that all failed, nothing is happening there. Social democracy is emerging in Germany. So this is what he means by referring to the nations here. So and having overcome French one-sidedness and of representing not true requirements, but so mind you, this is where I'm reading the quote. So he says, what we overcome, this French one-sidedness, let's say the poverty of philosophy, Proudhon, etc., is the philosophy in there again, the faults of philosophy. You will see in a moment why it can be interpreted, understood, read in that way. This quote I'm about to finish now. So French one-sidedness and of representing not true requirements, but requirements of truth. So what is overcome is the one-sidedness, the French one-sidedness, which also entails representing, mind you, the following: not true requirements, so real, objective, tangible requirements, but the requirements of truth with a capital T. Not the interest of the proletariat, but the interest of human nature with capital first letters, or of human in general. And human in general is the abstract human. So these are the abstractions he keeps struggling against. So what is overcome with the manifesto is what I just said. The fact that all socialism, French one-sidedness, so the socialist philosophy to that point, and mainly of French background, obviously, and so and the sociology as well. So their vision of communism and socialism is overcome thanks to the manifesto by overcoming the problem of them not representing true requirements, but the requirements of truth, not the interest of the proletariat, but the interest of some abstract human nature or man in general, who belongs to no class, no reality. So this is the philosophical man, right? Who belongs to no class, has no reality, reality, thus abstract, who are unreal. So you see the theme of reality keeps reappearing, who exists only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. So the manifesto is overcoming all of this, not representing the true requirements, but the requirements of truth, not representing the interest of the proletariat, but the interest of some men in general that does not belong to class and has no reality, who exists only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. So philosophical fantasy, again, the problem of philosophy and its fantasies. So I will end here. We are past our time. I don't even know if there are people still in or if there are questions. The next time I will be reading a bit more, my own work. It will be more structured. We will tackle also Zonretul in order to provide an account on abstraction that is informed by materialist epistemology, so acknowledging the relevant and existence of abstraction, but still remaining materialists, and remaining in fidelity to the original text of Marx. So we will approach all of that to a more organized format, because I will be mainly reading, not talking like this. And But before we do that, which is next week, let's talk. If there's still anybody around.